You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with journalist and author Christina Patterson and former Conservative Special Advisor Anita Boateng. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. Only two in at the moment. They were all waiting for that Manchester City victory to make that their front page. But the front of the Sunday Times reports that allies of Boris Johnson have abandoned him following his resignation as MP yesterday. They also claim the former Prime Minister is unlikely to seek a new seat as MP. The Sun on Sunday reports that Manchester United and England star Marcus Rashford has split with his fiancée. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Christina Patterson and Anita Boateng. Welcome to both of you. Let's start with the Sunday Times. As I say, only a couple of the papers in because of the football and Manchester City's victory over Inter Milan. But starting with the Sunday Times, their headline, allies abandon Johnson as Tory mutiny falls flat. Christina, take us into this.
Yes, well, I suspect this might hurt Boris Johnson, Teflon-skinned, though in many ways he appears to be, this headline, because he still seems to be half clinging to the delusion that everybody loves him, the country loves him, everybody's dying for him to rescue the Tory party, to become Prime Minister again, to make Britain great again. He's living in some kind of parallel universe. What he doesn't understand is that people in this country actually really cared about Partygate. They didn't take it as a trivial matter. And Sir John Curtis, the polling expert, has also said that essentially his popularity has just sunk. So he was expecting, I think, or at least hoping, lots of Tory MPs to rally behind him. 3 have resigned, though it seems they've resigned more in pique over the honours they are not getting than which they'd hoped to get than anything else. But sorry, two others have resigned, Nadine Dorries and Nigel Adams. But this seems a bit like the Windsor framework, that he was again hoping to rally lots of support to his side and against Rishi Sunak, and it's not happening. So whether he will ever face up to the fact that his moment for being Prime Minister has gone, I don't know. But I absolutely think his moment for being Prime Minister has gone. Thank goodness. And although he will continue to try to destabilise Sunak, the Tory party, the country, etc., from the sidelines, I really don't think he's ever going to be riding back into power.
Anita, the paper claims that sources close to Johnson claimed that up to 6 more Conservative MPs would stand down, but a number of his supporters quickly rule themselves out of any coordinated plot. So do you think that perhaps it was certain that 6 or more would also leave, but they've decided against it? They've changed their minds?
I always think when it comes to the sort of briefings to the papers, it's more in hope than in plotting. And I would have been surprised if we saw that volume of resignations. As Christina says, it seems like the 2 resignations are possibly more connected to the wranglings with the House, with the committee that decides on whether or not the Prime Minister's appointments to the House of Lords are acceptable or not. And the House of Lords, the House of Lords committee that looks at these appointments effectively said no to quite a few more than would normally be the case, and including, according to reports, one for Nadine Dorries and another for Nigel Adams. So it may be much more connected to that than a concerted effort to sort of destabilise the party.
And Christina, in terms of Rishi Sunak, this is it's a bit of a headache, isn't it, really?
Sorry to laugh, but I mean, Boris Johnson, of course, is very keen to be a headache for Rishi Sunak. And it is a headache for Rishi Sunak. There's a very interesting story also in the Sunday Times tomorrow by Tim Shipman giving more background on this story. And in fact, it appears that the Nadine Dorries and Nigel Adams and also Alok Sharma, who were all expecting to get peerages from Boris Johnson and told they would get peerages from Boris Johnson, it appears to have been his usual lack of attention to detail that has scuppered that, because apparently they would have had to resign within 6 months, and he vaguely thought that they could have their selections their nominations kind of revived in 6 months' time, and that's not the case. So I think, as always, Boris Johnson is seeing conspiracies where there weren't any, and I think the thing has not actually been blocked by the committee or by Rishi Sunak, but through this technicality that Boris Johnson didn't take the trouble to understand. So, as always, it's a kind of laziness on his part, really, lack of attention to detail. But I do think it's over for him. And I think that he will be a real pain in the backside to Rishi Sunak. But I don't think that's going to have a massive impact on the next election or Rishi Sunak's future. I just don't think Boris Johnson is the potent force in the Tory party that he thinks he is.
Anita, what are your thoughts on that? Because the Sun's inviting us to bet a fiver on Boris Johnson making a comeback. Maybe even before the next election.
Yes, and they have a rather punchy article from Sir James Duddridge, an MP who is a close ally of Boris Johnson, that has in it sort of a rundown of his greatest hits, and includes a quote saying that he's walked off the pitch rather than being red carded by a Sunday League ref, and is well worth a read for James's colourful language. I think that ultimately with Boris Johnson, it's a kind of well-worn trope that you should sort of never rule Boris Johnson out. But I do think that I cannot see the kind of benefit to Boris Johnson and his reputation, particularly as a winner, for him to attempt to remain in Parliament in any context in terms of trying to seek another seat that may become free as a result of these by-elections, or come free in the next sort of year and a bit before the general election. It's hard to remember now, but Boris Johnson really hasn't lost an election since sort of 1997, I think, when he stood in a sort of no-hoper seat for the Conservatives. And so I think that the part of the compelling mythos that we see in this article, again from James Duddridge in The Sun, is that Boris Johnson is a born winner who can connect with the electorate like no other. And I think if Boris Johnson were to see that, scuppered, either in the cases we've seen in Uxbridge, where whether it's recall petition or the by-election that might have resulted, or indeed the vote in Parliament, he may well have come a cropper, and he's shown himself to say, well, actually, I'm just not going to play. I'm taking back control. I'm going off into the sunset, and not to be forced otherwise. So I'm a little sceptical that we are going to see the comeback. And if I were a gambling woman, and I'm not, I would take up that bet of a fiver.
OK. Let's talk about another troubled politician, actually. Donald Trump. The Sun is running this piece, but also we heard from him the first time since his indictment this evening. Christina.
Yeah, well, I was naive enough to be delighted when I heard that he was going to be appearing in court on for being indicted, because of 37 documents that appear to have broken, highly classified documents that he kept in various places in Mar-a-Lago, including the shower, the bathroom. I mean, and some of these had nuclear information about sort of nuclear secrets. It's kind of breathtaking stuff. And you would think that would be enough if you would think that the very fact that he is being tried on such incredibly serious charges, which pretty much amount to espionage, or, kind of aiding and abetting espionage, because Mar-a-Lago is full of people who come and go, and anyone could have just picked up those documents at almost any time. But you would think this would count him out for running to be the most powerful person in the world again. But absolutely shockingly and disgracefully, it doesn't. Apparently, he can still run for president, even if he's prosecuted, even if he's in jail, which is just kind of mind-blowingly crazy. And what really struck me actually about, and of course he's now denouncing this as, he doesn't use the phrase kangaroo court, which Boris Johnson used yesterday, but he is, of course, saying it's all a conspiracy against him and Biden is the most corrupt president ever. But what struck me about Boris Johnson's a statement yesterday was how very Trumpian it was. I think he doesn't really like being compared to Trump, but he has become more and more Trump-like. This idea that there is never any court or committee or body democratically elected or appointed through
Christina.
procedures that in this case Boris Johnson authorised could be correct, that he just won't countenance. So it's shocking stuff.
Let us take a look at the Sun and this story about the long-awaited counteroffensive from Ukraine. It is official now because we've had Zelensky actually saying so. Christina.
Yes, well, obviously it's good if Ukraine's troops are making progress. They've been planning this counteroffensive for a very, very long time. But I have to say that in the light of what's happened this week with the Kakhovka Dam, which is an absolute tragedy, both ecologically and, of course, for all the people living in the area and for in terms of food production. I mean, this is something that could affect people in Africa. The consequences of what it looks as if Putin has done with the dam are so enormous that they really dwarf any gains that Ukraine have made or are making. And while obviously, I mean, everybody in this country pretty much wants Ukraine to win, just making some advances on this particular front line is not going to get Ukraine to win. And I'm afraid at the moment it's looking as if this is going to be an extremely long war. And it's very hard to see an end to it or a way out to it. So, I'm pleased that there is some good news, but I suspect that this is just a little bit of good news in a context where there is going to be an awful lot of bad news.
Anita, do you agree? Do you see this counteroffensive as being the beginning of the end or not?
Certainly not the beginning of the end. And counteroffensives are particularly risky. I think Russia has found that going on the offensive is difficult when you're up against a very determined defender. And I think it will be the same for Ukraine in this modern war. And Ukraine, I mean, the thing that Christina says is really important here, which is the levels of destruction that we're seeing is kind of almost impossible to describe. And it's interesting that Ukraine, for instance, have made a show of kind of going after Bakhmut, which is a city that the Russians kind of delighted a few months ago in saying they had captured effectively. Let's not forget, this entire city has been reduced to rubble. There are simply craters in the middle of what used to be schools and hospitals, and the entire infrastructure of the entire city is destroyed. So let's not forget that through this counteroffensive, which is fraught with risk for Ukraine, you could ultimately end up in a situation where the entire country is destroyed. And yes, it's definitely going to be a long fought out offensive, although Ukraine will be hoping to see some significant moves forward by the end of the summer.
OK, let's move to this story, this remarkable story of survival. The paper's calling it, the Sun calling it a miracle. These are the 4 children in the Colombian jungle, Christina. I mean, absolutely, well, I think it is a miracle.
Yeah, it's incredible. And thank goodness to get some good news in the midst of all of this. Yes, there was a plane crash in the jungle 40 days ago, and all the adults on the plane were killed, including, tragically, the parents of these children. But I think there was sort of pieces of evidence found in the jungle that pointed to the fact that the children might have survived, and this rescue campaign was launched, and now the children have actually been taken to safety and amazingly are not seriously injured or seriously ill. So it is absolutely incredible, and thank goodness that occasionally in life amazing things like this do happen.
Yes, and very quickly, Anita, you've got about 20 seconds, but the fact that the youngest is about 11 to 12 months.
Amazing. I don't think if I were that 13-year-old, I would have been able to keep alive my 9, 4, and less than 1-year-old siblings. It's absolutely incredible. I should enroll in a survival course.